Saturday, August 22. This morning I went down to the Tenarue with Lieutenant Colonel Buckley and Captain Moran, the interpreter. The stench of bodies strewn along Hell Point and across the Tenarue Spit was strong. Many of them lay at the water's edge, and already were puffed and glossy, like shiny sausages. Some of the bodies had been partially buried by wave-washed sand. You might see a grotesque bloated head or twisted torso sprouting from the beach. It was not pleasant to look at the piles of bodies on the spit, but that carnage was a pale painting compared to the scene in the grove across the spit. That was a macabre nightmare. We saw machine gun nests which had been blasted and their crews shredded by canister fire from our tanks. The tread tracks of one of our tanks ran directly over 5 squashed bodies, in the centre of which was a broken machine gun on a flattened bipod. There is no horror to these things. The first one you see is the only shock, the rest a simple repetition. Walking among the clustered dead of the grove, we could see why it had been difficult to spot the Japs from across the river. They had been well dug in, with excellent foxholes. It had taken our tanks to flush many of them from their holes. We found some interesting Jap equipment, several flamethrowers, which evidently had not been used, a small Jap field piece on a little cart, Bangalore torpedoes, long pipe-like bombs used to blow up barbed wire impediments. The Japs' packs contained canned heat, rice, cookies, soap. An extra pair of shoes and gas masks were strapped on the outside. And all the equipment was new. The Japs had been well equipped. We saw our tank, which had been stopped by a Jap grenade or mortar. It was undamaged, except for the fact that one tread was broken clean in 2. The machine was being towed away by a truck. The snipers who remained in the grove yesterday afternoon had been almost completely cleaned out. Patrols were setting out to finish off the remainder. We could hear scattered shots coming from the eastern part of the grove. Back at the airport, I found some long-nosed fighter planes, painted army brown, coming in for a landing. They were pursuit ships, the first army planes to arrive in Guadalcanal. The planes bore bright insignia and spectacular individual crests. One plane carried in large letters the legend, "The Flying Pole." The plane's aerial had been painted like a barber's pole carrying out the motif, and the pilot, inevitably, was a young man of Polish extraction named Lt. Edmund E. Brzuska, who came from Chicago. The leader of the group was Captain Thomas J. Christian, whose father is a brigadier general at Camp Sutton, North Carolina. At General Vandergrift's headquarters, we heard the story of a native police chief named Vuza. Vuza, it seemed, had been caught by the Japs on a scouting expedition and tied up and held prisoner when his captors found a small American flag in his possession. The flag had been given to him by Marines. Vuza said that the leader of the Japs who caught him was a notorious Jap agent named Ishimoto. Ishimoto had been a carpenter on Tulagi for years, ostensibly, while he carried on as an agent for the Japs. When the Japs had taken Tulagi May 5th, Ishimoto had been given a rank in the Jap land forces. He had apparently commanded at least a part of the troops which our forces turned back yesterday at the Battle of the Tenarue. Vuza, according to the story, was tied to a tree and questioned by Ishimoto as to the American strength and positions. When the middle-aged native refused to talk, the Japs, he reported, stabbed him with bayonets. Still, he would not talk. Finally, the Japs left him hanging from the ropes, with gushing wounds in his chest and throat. But the native, nothing daunted, chewed through his bonds with his teeth and walked 20 miles back to our lines. He was hospitalized. Vuza told our officers that Ishimoto had seemed certain of victory over our forces. Ishimoto, he said, had bragged about his force of more than 1,000 Japs, said they would mop up our people. I stopped at Colonel Pollock's command post and talked with him about the officers and men of his outfit who had distinguished themselves in yesterday's battle. There were many, but several were outstanding. PVT Joe Wadsworth had occupied a foxhole on Hell Point at the time early yesterday morning, when the Japs made their all-out effort to cross the Tenarue sandbar and penetrate our lines. He had fired at them with his automatic rifle, killing several until his gun jammed. Then he had picked up a Springfield rifle and fired with that, and finally, when the Japs had come close, he had jumped up and run to meet them with his bayonet. Then he had been struck by a bullet which knocked him down, but he had refused to be evacuated until the more seriously wounded had been cared for. Loot. George Codrea, whose platoon formed the foremost firing line in the furious fighting during the early morning hours, had been hit twice in the left arm by grenade fragments at 4:30 a.m., but he had stayed on the spot and continued to direct his men, although his wounds were very painful, until 11:30 when the pace of the fighting slackened a bit. Corp Lawrence A. D. Pietro Antonio, when the Japs took one of our field guns in crossfire and killed or wounded the crew and replacements, took over the gun single-handed and operated it as a one-man crew until others could join him. I stopped at Colonel Cresswell's headquarters, and he told me more tales, in practically endless sequence, about the Marines under his command who had done heroic things in the Tenarue battle. One of them was Corp, Raymond A. Negus, who had been wounded in both arms, the abdomen and left thigh as Cresswell's people closed in on the Jap positions from the rear. Two of his comrades had picked up Corp, Negus on a stretcher, but he had climbed off and told them to take cover, as they were exposed to devastating fire from Jap rifles, mortars and machine guns. And then he had crawled to a safer spot without assistance, despite his wounds. PVT Roy L. Barnes had shot a grenade out of the hand of a Jap as the Jap was about to hurl it at Barnes's platoon. When Lieutenant Maurice F. Ahern was wounded, a Navy corpsman, pharmacist's mate 3rd Class Richard J. Garrett, had deliberately placed himself between the wounded officer and the enemy rifleman. He had used himself as a human shield. Those were the outstanding among the scores of stories I was told by Coles, Cresswell and Pollock, but they were typical. The Battle of the Tenarue had been a first action for many of the Marines involved, but they had stood up to the enemy like more seasoned troops. Sunday, August 23. There is no laundry on Guadalcanal. It was one of the things the Japs forgot to provide. Apparently they did their own, as we must now do. I turned to this morning with a wooden bucket and a cake of laundry soap, and scrubbed several dirty items. After some hours of effort, I found the clothes were at least a tattletale grey, whereas they had formerly been a darker shade. It was a pleasant morning. And noontime came, and still there had been no air raid. It began to seem that we were going to enjoy one day of rest. But in the afternoon there came a disrupting surge of scuttlebutt. A slew of Jap ships were on their way to Guadalcanal. I checked the story with the best-informed sources and found it was true. Our patrol aircraft had spotted a large Jap naval force, 150 miles off, heading in our direction. There were transports, cruisers and destroyers to a total of about 14 ships. A striking force of our dive bombers went out to hunt the Japs. But before they could reach the enemy, the weather closed in so that they were unable to make contact. I was at our airport operations center when the pilots came back, looking broken-hearted about the matter. "I feel like hell about it," said the squadron leader, checking in with the operations chief. "But we just couldn't get in there." "I never saw anything like it," said another dive bomber pilot. "I came back from Tulagi 2 feet over the water, trying to get under the overcast. Even then I couldn't see anything." There was nothing more to be done about the matter for the moment, except to leave our shoes on when we went to bed that night, which we did. Monday, August 24. The expected Japanese task force did not show up during the night, but a Japanese submarine came up off Kukum at about 2 o'clock this morning and threw shells into Guadalcanal. When we heard the sound of the cannonading, Captain Dixon, Captain Nada and Major Phipps, my tent mates, rose up in the dark with a swift reflex and sneaked for our dugout, I with them. It was some time before we discovered what was happening. We could see that the sky over Kukum was illuminated by white light while the shelling went on, and judging from the suddenness with which the light snapped off and on, we estimated it was a searchlight. The sounds of cannonading were not alarming. We could hear the sound of the shell exploding before the whistle of the projectile passing through the air. And that was a good sign. It meant the shells were falling far short of us. 10 minutes after it had begun, the shelling stopped, but the alarm was not yet over. We could hear the low-toned muttering of motorboat engines coming from the direction of Kukum. Lieutenant Wilson checked on the phone. "Jesus," he said, "they ain't ours. All our boats are beached, all crews inland." We sat in the CP, waiting and talking while the usual cigarettes glowed in the darkness. It was a scary situation, sitting in the dark, listening to the sound of motorboats, and wondering if that sound marked the coming of the much-expected Jap landing party. But humour does not desert Americans in such situations. We sat, waited, and exchanged wisecracks. Major Gannon, however, brought news which dampened our spirits for a few minutes. "Number 4 gun had almost a direct hit," he said tragically. "I lost 2 men and 2 wounded." Our spirits sank. "It's too bad," he said, "but there it is." But later it developed that this first estimate, like a good deal of first news about casualties, was overly gloomy. We heard the verified fact in the morning that only 1 man had been seriously wounded in the shelling. I visited the spot in the morning with Colonel Phipps. 3 of those who had been slightly wounded were still on duty at the scene. They told me they still carried pieces of shrapnel in various parts of their arms and legs. I asked one of the wounded, a husky lad named Cagle, if his wounds did not hurt. "Sure, they hurt some," he said cheerfully, "like a bee sting, but outside of that they're okay." I looked at the spot where the 1 Marine who had been seriously injured had been lying asleep at the time of the shelling. It was a squat shelter constructed of wooden boxes which were now partially splintered. There was a small oval-shaped hole in the sand less than 10 feet away. Here the shell had struck, sending a shower of fragments into the Marine's shelter. "If he didn't have the little house, he'd have been a dead duck," said Peevtee Cagle. At about 2:30 in the afternoon, our air raid siren sounded, and we watched our swift fighter planes zooming into the overcast sky. They were straining to get upstairs before the Japs arrived. I went to an open spot at a bend in the Lunga River to watch the fighting. I could see no planes for a few minutes, ours or theirs, but I distinctly heard the tat-tat-tat of machine guns, the tortured sound of zooming motors. A plane swooped suddenly out of the sky, streaked over the treetops to my right, then another behind it. The second was one of our Grumman Wildcats. His guns rattled and stopped, then rattled and kept rattling. The first plane, I realized, must be a Jap fighter. Was he strafing the airport? I had time to think only that, and then both planes were gone. Then we heard the swishing sound of bombs falling, and a sharp, ground-shaking crack, crack, crack as they struck. From somewhere up in the grey continent of sky, the Jap bombers had dropped their sticks. I went to the airport immediately after the all clear and waited for our fighters to come down. Most of them seemed almost hilariously elated as they taxied in one by one and jumped down from their cockpits. For most of them, it was a first victory over the enemy, although a few had made contact with some Zeros on the 21st. A smiling, handsome lieutenant told me how he and another fighter pilot had knocked down 2 enemy bombers apiece. The pilot was Lieutenant Ken Fraser. I took the left side of the formation and Carl took the right. I let one have all my guns and he exploded. Then I moved my sights up a little and let go at the second guy. A sheet of flame came out of one of his motors. Loot. Fraser had, quite naturally, been excited by the experience. He could not say surely how many enemy bombers there had been, or whether they were 1 or 2 motored craft. A blond lad with very white teeth laughed as gaily as if he had been given a much-desired present as he told his story. He was Lute, J.H. King. "That bomber was flying along like a fat and happy goose," said Lute. King, "I dove at it and it just exploded at the first burst." He told me, laughing as if it were a huge joke, how he had been chased by a flock of Zeros. "I ducked into a cloud," he said. "Each time I came out I found them sitting there buzzing around and waiting." Colonel Fike, the greying executive officer of the Marine Flyers, was taking notes on their stories, arranging a tally of victory. The memo on his notebook pad showed a total of 10 bombers and 11 Zeros shot down in the fight. 2 of our fighter planes were still unreported when we left the airport. Another pilot had been seen to bail out over Tulagi Bay. The rest had returned. It was not a bad score at all. 3 of our men missing, in exchange for 21 Japs shot down. We drove across the airfield on the way back to our camp. The Japs had missed it completely, although the runways were obviously their target. In a neighbouring meadow, we saw 2 fairly regular lines of large craters churned into the black earth, where sticks of bombs had struck. A large trailer truck lay on its side, apparently overturned by the bomb blast, and the cab had been riddled, windshield shattered by bomb fragments. But it was a captured Jap vehicle, and no one, said bystanders, had been in the cab at the time. There were the usual rumours this afternoon that a large force of Japs were on their way in to attack Guadalcanal, and, and most of us went to bed again with our shoes on and our helmets within easy reach. But I decided to be comfortable for once, despite the rumours, and took off pants, shirt, shoes and socks. Tuesday, August 25. My taking off my clothes last night, with a view to sleeping more comfortably, turned out to be a great mistake. Just after midnight this morning, my sleep was shattered by explosions coming very close. The instant reflex action took me out of bed and onto the ground, flat. I knew that the others were leaving our tent, dashing for the dugout. I fumbled for my helmet and couldn't find it. I could hear heavy gunfire in a sequence that I knew instantly was ominous. The metallic, loud broom-broom of the guns going off, then the whistle of the approaching shells, then the crash of the explosions, so near that one felt a blast of air from the concussion. I ran for the dugout, not stopping even for slippers, but hit the deck and stopped dead still just inside the tent flap when I heard more shells on the way. The crash of the explosions dented in my eardrums, and I could hear the confused sounds of debris falling. Colonel Hunt and I arrived at the dugout at the same moment. We bumped into each other at the entrance and then backed away, and I said, "You go first, Colonel." He said politely with a slight bow, "No, after you." And we stood there for a few moments, arguing the matter, while the shells continued to fall. The Colonel, too, had decided to sleep comfortably last night, and now wore only his civvy, drawers and shirt. We must have made a comical couple, for I took a riding for the rest of the day about the Alphonse and Gaston act performed in underwear and under fire. But the humour of that moment was soon gone. When the barrage halted, we could hear a blubbering, sobbing cry that was more animal than human. A Marine came running to the dugout entrance to say that several men had been badly wounded and needed a corpsman, and the crying man kept on, his gurgling rising and falling in regular waves like the sound of some strange machine. I edged around a smashed tent toward the sound and found myself amidst a scene of frightfulness. One grey-green body lay on its back. Nearby lay the wounded man who had been crying in the night. A big, muscular fellow, he lay on his right side, while a doctor bandaged the shredded remains of one leg, and a corpsman worked on the twisted, gaping mouth of a wound which bared the other leg to the bone. His face and shoulders lay in the centre of a sheet of gore. Face wounds rained blood on the ground. A deep excavation through layers of tissue had been made in one shoulder. The other shoulder, too, was ripped by shrapnel. I could see now how he made the terrible noise. He was crying, sobbing, into a pool of blood. The blood distorted the sound of his wailing, as water would have done, into a bubbling sound. The sound still came in cycles, rising to peaks of loudness. One of the wounded man's hands moved in mechanical circles on the ground, keeping time with his cries. There were others wounded. 2 dim lights, set in a square dark shape, marked an ambulance standing by. Corpsmen were loading it, the squeak of the stretchers sliding into place, a sound much like that of a fingernail scratched across a blackboard, I shall never forget. Next to the smashed tent stood the splintered trunk of a palm tree. The top of the tree had fallen onto another tent, squashing one side of it. The tent walls, which still stood, had been torn by flying shell fragments. Back at Colonel Hunt's headquarters shack, I found Captain Hodges, the Australian guide, telling how the treetop had fallen onto his bunk. He found humour in the matter. "First time I ever had a tree in bed with me," he said. He was uninjured. When the wounded had been carted off, we went tentatively back to bed, and we were glad to hear our planes taking off, obviously in an attempt to attack the Jap ships which had been bombarding us. In the calm morning light, we found that our damage and casualties in the shelling had been amazingly slight when one considered the possibilities. Only the one shell, which had come so close to my tent, had caused any injuries. That missile had exploded when it struck the top of the palm tree. The downward blast of the explosion had killed the one Marine who had died instantly. The Marine whom we had heard crying in the night had also been hit by that shell. He had died of his injuries before morning. 2 others had been seriously wounded, but would not die. About 10 had suffered slight wounds from the flying fragments. The damage had been confined to the 2 tents, a few holes in surrounding structures, and the broken palm tree. We made up for the tree to some degree by serving the hearts of palm, a choice part of the branch, for lunch today. In general, it seemed amazing that the enemy could throw so many rounds of ammunition into our camp and do so little damage. We had word from our shore observation posts this morning that the force which had shelled us consisted of 3 destroyers. Evidently, the destroyers had been carrying troops which were landed at a point to the west of the airport, well beyond our lines. Then the small armada had swung along the shore to pay us their respects with high explosives. At the airport operations headquarters, Lieutenant Turner Caldwell, the leader of a squadron of naval dive bombers, told me that the marauding Jap ships had been spotted by our planes and a possible hit scored on one of the destroyers. Anybody that flew over the spot today could see an oil slick about 25 miles long, he said. It might be we sank the destroyer. While we were talking, there was an almost continual roar of planes taking off from the airport. They were going out to attack the large Jap task force of warships and transports which had been hovering in this area. More bombing flights went up all through the day. The results were encouraging. The Jap forces had been turned back and dispersed, and one of their cruisers and 2 transports badly damaged. At the aviation bivouac, I found a group of marine dive bomber pilots sprawling under a tent canopy. They seemed exhausted, and most had wiry, incipient beards and dirty faces. They had been flying since midnight this morning. Some of them told me they had slept in their planes. They told their stories cheerfully. Major Richard C. Mangrum, leader of the group, told me smilingly about the unusual way in which he had hit one of the Jap transports. I dived on the cruiser in our original attack, he said, but my bomb got stuck and wouldn't come off. I didn't know about it at the time. When we were flying back home after the attack was completed, the other guys told me my bomb was still on, so I left the formation and went back. I saw a transport then that we hadn't even seen before. I guess it had been under a cloud. Major Mangrum's radio man and rear gunner, Corp Dennis Bird, described the hit the Major had scored. The bomb seemed to hit near the fantail, he said. A big column of smoke and water went up. Bird said he was sure the steering apparatus of the ship must have been damaged. The pilot said it is always hard to see your own hit if you are a dive bomber, because by the time the bomb strikes, you are too busy pulling out of your dive and dodging anti-aircraft to take time to look behind you. A radio man rear gunner who faces the rear, or a squadron mate, however, often has an excellent view. Lieutenant Lawrence Baldinas had not been able to see the hit he scored directly amidships on the largest Jap transport, which incidentally carried the large red flag of a Jap general or admiral, and might have been a flagship. But Lieutenant Donnie McCafferty said he had enjoyed a fascinating view of Baldinas's bombing. The bomb hit right by the bridge, he said, and everything went up as if it was made of wood, like a model in the movies. I veered over to watch it. I was so fascinated, just everything spraying up and coming down. Major Mangrum said he had seen Baldinas's transport, which was a big ship of about 14,000 tons, burning fiercely, and seen indications that the crew were abandoning ship. There were small boats all over the water, he said. I found Lot Fink, the naval dive bomber who had hit the enemy cruiser, a new vessel of the Jinsu class. He was a slow-speaking Westerner, and said, as the other pilots had said, that he had not had a chance to watch his bomb hit. But his radio man, Milo L. Kimberlin, of Spokane Wash, told the story. The bomb hit right on the bridge, and a sheet of flame and smoke went right up to the clouds. I could see the stack and bridge lift out of the ship and go kerplunk into the ocean. She was still burning when we left. You could see the smoke and flames for about 40 miles. I was skirting the airfield en route to Colonel Hunt's CP this afternoon when the air raid alert sounded, and a few moments later we heard the impressive sound of many powerful engines and saw the usual thin silver line of Japanese bombers spanning the sky. There were 21 of them this time. I counted them. Then, as they were almost overhead, I dashed for shelter behind a huge limestone rock. I heard the bombs coming down, and the swishing sound of their descent was louder than I had ever heard it before. I forgot technique, forgot the approved method of taking bomb cover, which is to support yourself a little on elbows to avoid concussion, and instead burrowed as deeply as possible into the ground. The crash of the stick of bombs was loud, and I felt the earth jerk with the impact. Clods of dirt came showering down. When the last carump had sounded, I waited a few seconds, then got up a bit shaken and looked across the grassy field at a row of fresh, clean-cut black bomb craters. The ground everywhere around was strewn with small, cube-shaped clods of earth. I measured off the distance between me and the nearest crater. It was not much more than 200 yards. Tonight I heard cheerful reports of an action between our naval forces and the Japs, somewhere near Guadalcanal. Our torpedo bombers from a carrier had attacked the Jap carrier Ryuzyo and probably sunk it. At the same time, 81 Jap planes had attacked one of our carriers, and 71 had been shot down. Our bombers had scored hits on other Jap warships of unspecified number and type. Wednesday, August 26, Bob Miller and I were standing at the edge of the airfield today when the now routine Jap air raid occurred. We now have the timing of these matters pretty well organized. We know about how long we can afford to watch the bombers coming before taking cover. Today we heard the bombs screeching down as loud and close as they were yesterday. Then we piled into a small foxhole. This time I remembered to support myself slightly on my elbows, to avoid concussion, in case one came too close. Some of our people have been so badly shaken by close ones that they have suffered shock and prolonged bleeding from the nose. The worst time in a bombing is the short moment when you can hear the bombs coming. Then you feel helpless, and you think very intensely of the fact that it is purely a matter of chance whether or not you will be hit. The chances vary with your location. The Japs are bombing such and such an area, so many acres. The circles of fragments from their bombs will cover a certain proportion of the total acreage. You wonder if your portion of the acreage will be overlapped by the acreage of the bombs. If you are caught on the airport by a bombing, you can figure your chances for escaping injury are much fewer than elsewhere, for the airport always seems to be the Japs' target. But even in other parts of the island, where odds may be greater, say 9 out of 10 that you won't be hit, you wonder if you will be the unlucky 10th case. You will also think about those who have been cruelly wounded or killed by previous bombings, and in your imagination you suffer the shock of similar wounds. You also wonder why, instead of getting into a shelter which has a sandbagged roof, you stayed around to gawk and left yourself only time to get to an open foxhole or nothing at all for protection, except the flatness of the earth. When you have nothing but the earth and our lack of altitude to protect you, you feel singularly naked and at the mercy of the bombs. These thoughts pass very swiftly through your head during the short time that seems so long, the time when you hear the bombs swishing and rattling through the air on their way down to you. And while your mind is racing through these thoughts, your ears, without any conscious effort on your part, are straining to gauge the closeness of the bombs from the swishing and the rattling of them. After the sticks have hit, you wait a few more minutes, suffering from a disinclination to get up immediately. You watch the ground close in front of your eyes, very patiently, and wait to see if there will be another stick or more sticks. Usually, here on Guadalcanal, there are no more sticks after the bombers have made one run. They do not come back then because they are too busy trying to fend off our fighters. When you finally get up to look around, you have butterflies in your chest and your breath is noticeably short and your hands feel a bit shaky. Those feelings do not seem to be avoidable by any conscious effort. This morning Miller and I jumped up rather quickly after the sticks had cracked down, and before the dust columns of the explosions had settled, saw reddish flames leaping into spreading brown smoke at the far edge of the field. Some of the bombs had hit one of our oil dispersal dumps, but there did not seem to be any other damage. General Vandergrift passed us in his jeep. He was anxious to see what damage, if any, the bombs had done to the airfield. Miller and I hitched a ride with him, and we dashed over toward the fires. But as we came close, we could see that only a few barrels had been hit. I can see those Jap pilots turning in a report about how they turned the airport into a holocaust, said Miller. How they could see the flames for 40 miles. We laughed, because undoubtedly that was just what the Japs did, those who got back. Somewhere up in the sky the crescendo, protesting wails of zooming and diving motors could be heard, and the chatter of machine guns. We knew many of the Japs would never get back to make any report at all. The general turned his jeep to another part of the airport, and that was fortunate, for a delayed action bomb, a big fellow, blew up near the spot where we had turned, a few seconds after we left. Miller and I hopped off at one of the shelter pens, the skeletal type of hangars the Japs had built on the airport, and waited for our flyers to come down. Marion Carl came in, grinning happily, to tell us that he had shot down his 5th and 6th planes, both zeros. The lads call him the Zero Man, literally a very unflattering title, but in this connotation quite agreeable to Carl. The other pilots seem to have great respect for Carl. They don't mention it to him, but one of them told me today, "What a pilot! He's a natural, always relaxed. Carl was with the Marine Flyers on Midway during the Great Battle and shot down 1-0 there. I asked him how the Zeros he was meeting over Guadalcanal compared with those at Midway. "I don't know why," he said, "but we got shot up a lot more there than we do here. Maybe the pilots were better than these." Captain John L. Smith, of Lexington, Oklahoma, Carl's squadron leader, is a more quiet type. He has the steadiest eyes I have ever seen. They are brown and wide-set, and you fancy they would be most at home looking out over the great plains of the West. Smith is a prairie type. Tanned face, wide cheekbones, the erect head of a horseman, a thick neck set on square shoulders, a big, sinewy body. You get the impression that life must have a calm, elemental simplicity for him. Captain Smith did not say so, but he is the ace among the flyers on Guadalcanal. Already he has shot down 9 enemy planes, and that success does not seem to have excited or perturbed him at all. Back at my tent I found Don Dixon and Lute, McLeod, William J. McLeod of St. Petersburg, FLA, sitting on a bunk, deep in conversation. They seemed to be working over some sort of document. Dixon, who usually has a wonderfully good temper, said rather curtly, "We have a little private matter here." I felt a little cut, but later found out what the conspiracy was. PFC Tardif informed me that I was under arrest, and 2 Marines with fixed bayonets took me in tow. Dixon came by and said with mock gravity, "You're a prisoner of war." Captain Hodges, the Australian, was also brought along under military guard. We stood side by side. "Stand at attention, Pivot Tragaskis," snapped Lute. Wilson, while Colonel Hunt marched out and gravely read a long citation for each of us. This document honoured us for our speed in getting to a dugout amidst a bombardment and drafted us for membership in the Longer Point shell-dodging Marines. Don Dixon, who had been an artist and cartoonist in civilian life, had embellished our citations with comic drawings. Making them had been his private matter in the tent. The documents were embellished with official-looking seals made from Jap beer bottle labels. Colonel Hunt solemnly pinned captured Japanese medals on Viv Hodges's chest and mine. It was the 8th Order of Palanaua. "We found a case of those in the Jap tent camp," said Colonel Hunt. Tonight was quiet. The Jap submarine, which visits us nocturnally, we now call it Oscar, did not show up, nor did the cruisers and destroyers which have often bothered us. But I was not to have any rest this night, despite the quiet of the evening. I was awakened by the unpleasant symptoms of a local epidemic, which the doctors call gastroenteritis. I thought I could sleep off my illness, but that was impossible. This was a formidable assault of the ailment. I generated a dizzying fever and nausea. This morning the air raid alert sounded. I felt too sick to move from my cot, whatever happened. Don Dixon came in and said the warning had become urgent, and asked if I wanted help in getting to the dugout. I told him I would stay where I was. I heard the drone of planes in the sky and got my helmet and put it on, then turned face down on the cot. That way I figured I would have a maximum of protection. But the bombers did not make a run today. They jettisoned their bombs somewhere in the backwoods. Evidently they are growing chary of our fighters. Yesterday, according to the official count, our fighters downed 7 Jap bombers and 5 Zeros. For some time I lay abed, feeling dizzier and sicker by the moment. I could hear the booming of cannon-firing batteries. Don Dixon told me it was our own batteries I heard. They were shelling the Matanikau-Kokumbona area. The Jap forces, which had been landed piecemeal at night time, had filtered back into those villages. We were going to blast them out. The artillery was softening the positions. Then a large body of troops was going to move in later in the day. Dr. Hopkins came in to give me some medicine. My nausea quickly disposed of it. After that, I was carried off feet first. I remember hearing the familiar squeak of the stretcher as I was put into the ambulance, the bouncy ride, losing my sense of direction, and reading several times the red letters USN-MC painted on the stretcher above mine, being placed on a cot that was too short for me, as most of them are, and then suffering through 4 or 5 hours of tortured sleep, and being conscious that my fever was rising and nausea increasing. I had a bad case. It was dark when I became conscious of movement and talking at the entrance to the tent. I heard the shuffling of feet, and somebody said, "His clothes are wet, better get 'em off." They had brought in a casualty. I was too sick to be interested. But the voices kept on. "What's the matter with him?" "Sunstroke." Then I heard grunts and groans. They were moving the man from the stretcher to bed. "He's a big un," said a voice. A doctor spoke in a pleasant, soft voice. "Were you out in the sun?" he asked. The man spoke as if it were difficult to summon wind enough for words. "Cheese," he said. It was a sort of gasp. Then he said, "Cheese," again, and finally, "I've got a platoon, on the ridge." "You're in the hospital now," said the doctor. "I'm Dr. Lynch." The man said "cheese" again, and then, sick as I was, I recognized the voice. It was Lute Donahue of Jersey City, one of my shipmates on the transport which had brought me to Guadalcanal. Finally, the corpsman brought Lute. Donahue too, and he told, between gasps of "cheese," a foggy story of having been out on a ridge with his machine-gun platoon. They were advancing on Matanicao with the other troops, he said, when the commanding officer ordered him to take his platoon up onto a steep, rocky ridge. "My men pooped out," he said, "after we got up. I went down to look for Captain Hawkins. I asked where he was. Next thing I remember, Dr. Claude giving me a drink cheese." Another of the men in the tent, a young lieutenant who was recuperating from gastroenteritis, wanted to chat in the evening. He and the corpsman in charge talked about the fight for Matanicao. The corpsman said there had not been many casualties in today's attempt to get into the town. He said there were some killed and wounded, but the wounded weren't being brought here. They were being taken to another hospital. Friday, August 28 Lute. Donahue repeated his story this morning. He said he felt better, but he talked as if thinking and speaking were a great effort. The young lieutenant who is recuperating talked with the corpsman about how good the chow was at this camp. The lieutenant said he wished he could stay a while. Possibly by accident he smoked a cigarette just before his temperature was to be taken. This upset the corpsman, who accused the lieutenant of gold bricking, which, after some confusion, the lieutenant cheerfully admitted. Lieutenant Donahue, at the opposite extreme, begged the doctor to let him go, as his mind cleared at about midday. "I hate to lie down in one place, Doc," he said. I still suffered from nausea and vomiting and fever, and was not inclined to be interested in any of these goings-on, or even curious when later in the afternoon a lot of our planes took off, and there was a great excited passing of scuttlebutt about a huge Japanese task force, which was supposedly on its way to attack Guadalcanal. I got the news next day that a force of one small Jap destroyer and 3 larger ones had been spotted by a patrol of our dive bombers near Santa Isabel Island. The dive bombers had attacked the small destroyer and set it afire, and a striking force, the other planes which we had heard taking off, had found the small destroyer listing and burning, and had attacked 2 of the others. Both of these had been hit. One exploded and sank, and the second burned and was apparently heavily damaged. Lieutenant Donahue talked about the advance on Matanicao. He said that en route he had passed the mutilated body of a young woman lying by the side of the trail. He said that the girl had been raped and her torso hacked. Tonight the other patients in the tent, who were with one exception in better shape than I, spent an interminable time yarning about the Solomons campaign to date. Some of the stories were fairly interesting, like the one about the Jap who, in the first night on Tulagi, was challenged by a marine sentry. The Jap said in English that he was the corporal of the guard. "Okay, bud," said the marine, and opened up with his pistol. There was no such thing as a corporal of the guard in that organization. Another story, which I had heard before, was about the Japs in one of the dugout caves on Tulagi. An interpreter went out to ask them in Japanese to surrender. One of the Japs had stuck his head out of the entrance and answered in colloquial English. That led to other yarns about the Japs' ability to speak English, and the alleged fact that many of the dead wore American high school rings. Then there were stories about the American mementos that had been found on Jap bodies, American cigarette cases, etc. Then the yarning turned to our first days on Guadalcanal, the large amount of shooting at shadows during the first few nights ashore, and how allegedly the general had issued an order that no shots should be fired, that only the bayonet should be used, and that this measure had cut down the unnecessary firing. That was the story. And so the yarning went on, and finally somebody told the classic story about the 2 marine jeep drivers on Guadalcanal, supposedly a true story, very true anyhow, in its essential American psychology. It was about 2 jeeps passing in the night, one with proper dim-out headlights, the other with glaring bright lights. Saturday, August 29. This morning at about 4 o'clock I heard somebody shout, "Air raid!" and slid out of bed and through the folds of my mosquito net and onto the floor just as the bombs came swishing down. The crack of their explosions, however, was not loud, and I surmised they were small ones. We found after the excitement was over that some Jap float planes had made a sneak attack. The bombs had fallen far from the airfield and caused only a few casualties. From 9:30 on, we spent the morning dragging ourselves to a dugout and back. There were 3 air raid alarms. The shelter was crammed with sick people. The feverish, emaciated wrecks, most of them suffering from gastroenteritis, were a pitiful sight. The Japs did not show up until noontime. Then there were 24 bombers with an escort of 22 Zeros. I climbed out of the murky air of the dugout. I was feeling well enough to haul myself around without help by this time, and watched our anti-aircraft bursting in the sky. Then came a shower of bombs, and I could see the dark brown smoke of their explosions rising above the treetops. Our fighters caught the Japs. I heard the familiar sound of diving or zooming motors and rattling machine guns in the clouds. And then one plane came tearing down out of the sky in the most awful power dive I have heard. The sound accelerated and rose in a crescendo that filled the sky. I never saw the plane, but it seemed a certainty that it was coming down directly on top of us. But I heard the plane crash some distance away, and a cloud of black smoke edged up over the trees to the south. It was a Jap bomber. Visitors who came later in the day to our tent said that the plane had come down vertically and must have been going well over 600 miles an hour when it hit the ground, and that it disintegrated like a bomb on impact. Apparently the pilot had been killed, and in his dying efforts had jammed the controls forward. The total tally of our pilots for the day was 3 Jap bombers downed and 4 Zeros. We had lost no planes in the fighting. A Marine who came in to bring some clothes to one of the inmates of our tent told us that Matanikau had been successfully occupied by our troops, but that the resistance indicated that the Japs had been landing troops and supplies. And the impression had been confirmed by the discovery of large stores of fresh ammunition and food cans. It is rather easy for the Japs to build up strong forces, piece by piece, on other parts of this island, if the transporting ships can reach our shores unharmed, which they have been able to do. We hold a tiny strip of this island, a toehold, a piece about 7 miles wide and 4 miles deep, centering around the airport. The Japs can move about the remainder of the island, which is 90 miles long and 30 miles deep, almost at will. Sunday, August 30. We were roused at 1:30 this morning by an alert and went over to the air raid shelter in the moonlight. But no aircraft appeared, and at 1:45 we went back to bed. I helped a feverish gastroenteritis sufferer from the steaming dugout and found his arm hot to the touch. I was glad that I had shaken the disease. After breakfast, I got my discharge from the hospital and went down to Kukum. 2 ships were lying offshore, one a freighter, the other the auxiliary transport Calhoun. We had an air raid alert soon after, and the 2 ships up-anchored and hustled off to sea, where they would have more room to maneuver evasively if attacked. Lieutenant Commodore, Dexter told us we would have a good view of the raid from the beach. We have the best spot on the island, he said. We see the approach, the anti-aircraft fire, watch the bombs drop, see the dogfights, and send boats out to pick up the aviators who get shot down. But today there was a low ceiling of heavy, dark, cumulus clouds, and a beneficent rain squall covered the Calhoun and the freighter. They were blotted out of sight even from shore. No bombers appeared, but we heard the sounds of a furious dogfight coming from the high banks of clouds. It lasted for about 10 minutes. At the airport, we talked to the fighter pilots as they came in from the raid. Captain Smith told us he had had his biggest day of fighting, had shot down 4 Zeros, 3 of them, he said in a minute and a half. I dove on one, shot him down, and saw another on my wingman's tail, he said calmly. I slewed over and picked off that one. Then I saw one coming at me from below and ahead. I nosed over and dove right at him and let all my guns go. I had a tough time avoiding crashing him head on. I could see the prop shatter, and I came so close I could see his damned head, his helmet and goggles. He was trying to climb out of the ship then, and I guess he used his chute. After that, said the captain, He had ammunition left for only one gun. He lit out for the airport, trying to sneak in low over the water. "I was flat-hatting along the beach at about 50 feet, he said, when I saw 2 Zeros ahead and to the right. I made a run on one of them with my one gun and saw him fall off and dive into the water. The other one took off as fast as he could go. I did too, because I'd used up all my ammo." Captain Carl also had a good day's dogfighting. He told us happily that he had shot down 3 more Zeros, making his total score 9 to date. At General Vandergrift's headquarters, we got the official word that 18 of the Zeros encountered that day had been shot down. General Vandergrift was happy about it. Today, he said, interception had been perfect. The bombers were driven off and most of the Zeros destroyed. But the afternoon was not yet over. Suddenly we got word of a surprise air raid and raced for cover. Then we felt the ground shake from deep down, as if there were an earthquake. There was a succession of tremors, and we heard deep, dull, booming sounds coming from the direction of Kukum. I raced for the open and saw a towering black cloud mushrooming over the trees in the direction of Kukum. The cloud of smoke mounted higher into the sky, and then we heard the news. The Kalboon had been hit by Jap bombers. They had come in 3 waves, a total of 16 bombers, and the little auxiliary transport had been hit squarely by 3 bombs. She had sunk almost immediately. Miller and I set out for Kukum immediately in a jeep, but it was impossible to get there. The roads were jammed with trucks bringing in survivors and wounded. We gave up the project of getting to Kukum, and I contented myself with talking to Dr. Bill Duell, who had seen the bombing. The deep explosions which we had felt shaking the earth, he said, had been caused by depth charges. A submarine had been hovering in the vicinity at the time the bombers attacked the Calhoun. One of our destroyers had dropped a series of depth charges at the same time the Calhoun was being bombed. "I saw a lot of little puffs travelling along the surface where the depth charges were going off," he said. "You could feel the ground shake. It was terrific out there on the beach. And then the black bow of the sub just reared out of the water like a whale and sank back." Losing the Calhoun seemed like a terrible tragedy at the moment, but later in the evening we heard that the loss of life aboard the ship had been slight. We had recovered about 100 of the crew, lost only about 38. Tonight there was none of the usual scuttlebutt about an enemy task force being on its way into our island, but late in the evening we heard the sounds of many of our planes taking off and surmised that some sort of contact had been made. Sunday, August 31st. This morning at operations headquarters on the airport, we heard that 4 Japanese troop-carrying destroyers had been spotted last night trying to land forces at Coley Point, about 20 miles to the east of our positions. The 2 flyers who had spotted the ships were on patrol at the time. They had dropped their bombs, but the visibility was poor, and they were undergoing heavy anti-aircraft fire at the time. The combination had made it hard for them to observe the effects of their bombing. After that, the patrolling pilots had called by radio for supporting aircraft, but the striking force which we had heard taking off had failed to intercept the enemy. Evidently, they had hauled out of the area after the attack of our 2 patrol planes. I heard that one of the 2 patrol flyers had been wounded. Then I learned that he was an ensign whom I had met on a previous Pacific War adventure, Spike Conzette. I went down to the field hospital to see Spike. One of his long legs was bandaged in the region of the knee, and he looked a bit drawn. He said he had a chunk of shrapnel in there, and that it pained a bit now. "I didn't even see those birds until they opened up with anti-aircraft, and I got this," he said, motioning toward his leg. "They shot out my instrument panel, filled the cockpit full of holes, and scared the hell out of me." Spike said that the other flyer up with him, a Captain Brown of the Marines, had spotted the enemy ships before he did. Brown had dived on one of the ships. "The weather was pretty thick up there," said Conzette, "but I made an approach and dived and let my bomb go too. On the way back here I got lost and thought I'd never get out of it. I was trying to fly by what instruments I had left, and that didn't work out very well. I got into a spin and spun down from 8,000 to about 4,500 before I could pull out of it. My radio man said he was figuring on getting out and hitting his chute. It was that bad. But after he got out of his spin," said Spike, "things straightened out a bit and he found his way back to Guadal, but," he added, "I was pretty feeble when I reached here, and I couldn't find the runway. I was lucky to get in at all. There were 3 air raid alarms today, but none of them developed, and enemy planes reached Guadalcanal only on the 2nd alarm. They were frightened by our fighters and jettisoned their bombs in the jungles to the southwest, and then retreated precipitously. The longest air raid alarm lasted from 12:30 to 1:30. I picked out a comfortable foxhole by a bend in the Lunga and lay on my back, watching the sky. It was pleasant there, lying beside the swift-moving water, infinitely preferable to the hot dugouts where most of our people go for such occasions. Tuesday, September 1st. Good news today that our coast defences are being strengthened by extra artillery of large calibre. This news heightens the general air of optimism, which is engendered by a combination of other circumstances. The fact, for instance, that for the last 2 days the Jap bombers have shown themselves to be frightened and cautious. They have turned back and unloaded their bombs. And then the fact that last night was particularly calm, with no shillings either by Oscar or the usual force of Jap destroyers or cruisers. Furthermore, things have been quiet along our land fronts, and large numbers of Japs have been coming in to surrender. Apparently their food is getting short. Increased numbers of ships have been coming in with supplies of late, including food as well as ammunition. Soon, we hope, we may be able to start eating 3 meals a day, getting away from our present scanty schedule of 2 meals. We are also becoming a little more comfortable in our island quarters. A few elementary necessities like privies have been slammed together, mostly made from prefabricated Japanese housing sections which we captured here. Our privy, at Colonel Hunt's command post, is called MacLeod's Masterpiece, after Lute MacLeod, who built it. A rope set on stakes has been constructed leading from the command post to the masterpiece, so that one may find his way in the dark. Lute Wilson has labelled this the MacLeoderheim line, and set up a poster celebrating the fact. We also have an oven which has been fashioned from a captured Japanese safe, so that Juan Morera, our cook, can make bread. Bread, however, is still so scarce that it is received with whoops of joy and eaten with as much relish as if it were cake. It is startling to think how one's standards of values change under the continued impetus of living conditions such as ours on Guadalcanal. Things like bread and privies, considered the barest necessities at home, become luxuries. One thinks of warm water, the smooth water closet seat of civilization, and a bed with sheets as things that exist only in a world of dreams. Miller and I went to Kukum at about noon today to watch for an air raid. There was an urgent alert, but again the Japs did not appear. We went for a swim in the beautiful clear water along Kukum Beach. The swimming was superb, but would have been more enjoyable if we had not found it necessary to look out for sharks. Sharks are the principal hazard of swimming in salt water hereabouts, that and the hazard of getting fungus infections in the ear, just as crocodiles impinge on one's contentment while swimming in the Lunga River. This afternoon, trucks came to dump a pile of grey canvas sacks at Colonel Hunt's CP. It was mail, the first to reach the troops since we landed on Guadalcanal. Each man seemed as happy as if you had given him $100 bill at the mere thought of getting mail, and that evening was an orgy of reading. Most of the men had 3 or 4 letters each. They sat about in circles and read them several times, and read pieces of them to each other. Guy Nada dashed into our tent with a letter in his hand and shouted, "I'm a father." The girl's name, he said, was Geraldine, and she had been born on the 27th of June. Don Dixon stood at the tent door, watching more mail being sorted out for delivery. Mail should have priority before food, he said. Colonel Hunt had 3 letters. They're from Dear Mom, he said, and no bills. Sergeant Charlie Morris had a bill, however. It was from the Book of the Month Club. I saw a circle of Marines clustered about one of the lads who had a reputation for being a demon with the gals. These, he said, were letters from his #1 girl. "That's the only dame he could never make," said one of his admirers good-naturedly. "He wants to marry her." The sheik only chuckled. "The trouble with you is you never met a virgin." Wednesday, September 2nd, Guy Nada, who is a communications officer, waked me at 2:30 this morning to ask if I wanted to come to the radio dugout. "They've got an enemy contact," he said. "Want to listen to the calls?" "They caught some ships that were landing troops," he said, as we probed our way through the night. We climbed down into the lantern-lit dugout and Nada gave me an earphone. The set was tuned to our inter-air frequency. We could hear planes taking off from the airfield, but there was no sound in the earphones, except the crackling of static. Nearly an hour later, we heard the message. To all planes from control. Plane 2 is in the target area. He will drop flares, he will drop flares. A few minutes later, over enemy ships dropping flares. A report from plane 2 on the job. But the other planes were having trouble trying to spot the enemy. I am down to 1,000 feet trying to pick up enemy. Visibility very poor. I had begun to realize before this how difficult are flying weather conditions around Guadalcanal, how hard it is for our planes to spot enemy ships at night unless the moon is very bright. Now we heard some of the planes, having difficulty in the thick overcast, calling control in an attempt to find out the exact enemy position. One pilot heard the calls and reported, "During initial dive on the cruiser, it was heading due east. That was 15 minutes ago. She was making 20 knots. I haven't located them since." "How many miles east of the field?" asked control. 20 miles, was the answer. "The enemy is landing troops at Taivu Bay, 20 miles east of the airport," reported control to all planes. A few minutes later, we heard inter-air conversations of pilots who were evidently on the scene, but could not locate the enemy. "Let's go down to 500 feet, said one voice. "They should be directly under us around here." But there was no contact. Weather conditions out there must have been abominable. I took off the earphone and looked out the dugout door. The night was black. There was no trace of a moon. It was after 4 o'clock when we heard the news of a contact relayed to headquarters. Control from Plane 3. 3 large landing boats sighted east of Taivu Point. Plane 27 corrected, 1 mile west of Taivu Point. But the weather was evidently too thick for interception. I gave up the long night watch at about 5 and went back to bed. I was just getting to sleep when I heard the sudden rattle of bombs on their way down. I shouted, "Hit the deck!" And the others in the tent were so well trained that we all landed on the tent floor at about the same moment, the moment that we heard the crack of the bombs exploding. Fortunately, they were not close to our camp, and fortunately the Jap attackers did not make another run on our positions. But there came salvos of gunfire a few minutes later, which apparently landed far down our shores to the east. Miller and I hustled to the headquarters building at the airport to find out whether any damage had been done to the Jap ships, which were apparently landing troops at Taivu last night. Colonel Fike said misty weather had interfered with the contact, but added that 3 large Jap landing boats had been strafed by our Navy and Marine flyers. An Army captain came in to report that his flight of pursuits, which had just returned from a patrol, had found 6 large Jap landing boats on the beach near Taivu. He reported there was no activity in the area, no people visible, and no sign of the Jap ships which had launched the boats. Colonel Fike said there was no definite information as to the number or type of ships, but probably they were several of the now familiar troop-carrying type of destroyer, and probably at least 1 cruiser, for the 2 planes which had come over and dropped bombs just before daylight this morning had been cruiser-type aircraft. At Colonel Cates's CP, we heard that there had been only 1 casualty in this morning's early raid, and that casualty had been a man who lost his leg in the explosion of a delayed action bomb. Our people are becoming more expert at taking cover. With the exception of those who stay out to watch the show, few are being injured or killed. 2 more correspondents have come in to Guadalcanal. They are Tom Yarbrough and Tillman Durden. They have glamorous fresh uniforms and make Miller and me feel like street urchins, for our hand-washed clothes are scarcely clean, and our faces stand in need of a good scrubbing with hot water. This afternoon we had 2 air raid alerts, and after the second, 18 Jap bombers appeared and dropped their sticks. 3 bombers and 5 fighters were shot down in the melee that followed. For a few minutes after the bombers had dropped their sticks, we heard the rattle of small arms fire and heavier explosions sounding like mortar or artillery shells, coming from the direction of the Tenaru. We wondered if the Japs were making another attempt to break through our lines, but Lute Wilson checked by phone and looked contented as he reported, "It's only a small ammo dump. Bombs set it afire." Colonel Hunt has one of the few desks in the Solomons, an item captured from the Japs. Some of the officers of the raiders came into the CP this afternoon and asked if they might use the desk. Then they spread out maps and started a deep discussion. I found they were laying plans for an expedition to Taivu, where the Japs last night apparently landed troops and supplies, and where, according to our scouts, there is now a good-sized task force. That should be an interesting excursion. I may go along.